Thank you very much. And now I give the floor and introduce the next moderator, that is Dr. Babatunde Olumide Omilois, who is manager of the Public Health, Security and Nutrition Division of the African Development Bank. So, Dr. Babatunde, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. I'm delighted to join the conversation and to moderate the next session. Ladies and gentlemen, the next session today, we are going to be looking at financing social protection extension strategy. How do we finance social protection? We all know that's the big thing to do. Let me just mention that at the African Development Bank, we take financing very seriously. And that's why we put together over $10 billion approved by our board in April last year to really support African countries in their responses to COVID-19. And part of that work, of course, we spend some of those resources to protect the vulnerable and the poor in Africa in terms of being able to extend social protection coverage to them. So today, we have 5 eminent panelists that are going to tell us what they are doing in terms of financing social protection in their various walks of life. The first speaker today is going to be Ms. Valerie Schmidt, the Deputy Director of Social Protection Department of the International Labour Organization, ILO. Ms. Valerie Schmidt, the question for you today is going to go on like this. The social protection coverage gap in Africa is associated with a significant underinvestment in social protection. ILO has published a handbook for assessing physical space for social protection in 2019 and 2 papers on investing more and better in social protection in 2020. Based on ILO research and international experiences, could you please share the main options for creating physical space for social protection and tell us how they can be implemented in the African context and help countries figure out the best financing options for social protection? Please, you have 5 minutes to answer this, Valerie, and please stick to the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Babatunde. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. So as all of us know, since the 2008 crisis and as recalled by the current COVID-19 crisis, social protection is an automatic stabilizer for the economy. And despite this evidence, it is obvious that efforts to extend social protection have remained largely insufficient in the past years. This explains why in today's world, and as recalled by Mrs. Shara Razavi and also by our regional director, Cynthia, 1 person in 2 has no access to social protection at all, and why around 80% or even a little bit more than 80% of the African population is excluded from social protection. One reason for this low coverage is the persistence of informality, which creates a vicious cycle between inadequate social protection, low levels of productivity, and inadequate fiscal resources. Another and related reason is that countries do not invest sufficiently in their social protection systems. According to a recent ILO study on financing gaps in social protection, today African countries invest only 5.7% of their GDP on social protection. They would need to invest an additional 8.2% of their GDP to achieve at least the social protection floor. This means that countries in Africa should more than double their current investment in social protection. There are 8 strategies available to all countries to invest more in social protection. These 8 options are explained in the ILO's Fiscal Space Handbook. I will focus only on a few of them. Additional investments should primarily come from domestic resources. And one way to increase domestic resources for social protection is to address tax evasion and the avoidance of social security contributions. Another way is to extend mandatory social security to workers in the informal economy in line with their contributory capacity. Mandatory is important as voluntary affiliation usually results in low take-up rates, as explained by Mr. Atta, the representative of Ghana. Coverage for those on low income could be subsidized through general taxation to facilitate their transition to the formal economy. And this was stressed by the UNDP representative several times. This was the strategy followed by Algeria for non-salaried workers and by Rwanda's social protection policy. And at the ILO, we have developed and launched a policy resource package on extending social security to workers in the informal economy that provides many other successful examples from Africa and elsewhere in the world. Another strategy is to reallocate resources within the state's budget and replace regressive allocations with progressive social protection investments. Removal of fuel subsidies, for instance, could liberate resources for social protection. Another strategy, you see there are many strategies, is to undertake tax reforms. Botswana and Zambia, for instance, have introduced taxes on their natural resources to finance non-contributory social protection. And Egypt and Ghana have introduced earmark taxes to finance their universal healthcare systems. These new taxes should be progressive to further increase redistribution, which is at the core of social protection systems. At the ILO, we have a very large EU-funded project that is co-implemented with UNICEF and the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors on increasing synergies between social protection and public finance management that helps already a number of African countries in increasing fiscal space for social protection.
One more minute, Valerie, please. Round up. Yes.
I would like to stress that mobilizing more resources for social protection requires active discussions with the ministries of finance to assess the financing needs and identify realistic and feasible financing options. Ministries of Labor and Social Affairs and social partners should therefore be more involved in these discussions in the context, notably, of the integrated national financing frameworks that are today supported by the UN system. For low-income countries, however, the financing gap are enormous. They represent 15.9% of their GDP. And without international financial assistance, it will be very difficult for them to build their national social protection floors. So investing more in social protection is a matter of urgency, yet this is not sufficient. Countries should also invest better in their social protection systems based on a national consensus achieved through social dialogue to ensure universal access to adequate social protection that leaves no one behind, that is sustainable, based on solidarity as stressed by many speakers, and fosters synergies with other policies. And ILO recommendation number 202 provides a number of principles that can be applied in extending social protection. So last word, by putting solidarity into practice, social protection reinforces the social fabric that was strained by COVID-19. So it's high time to invest more and to invest better in social protection, which will help us to build a better normal and achieve universal social protection by 2030. In this context, we invite all the countries who are participating in today's roundtable to join the USP 2030 partnership. And please contact us to have more information on this partnership. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Valerie, even though you took a little bit of time, but I think that was really very impressive, especially highlighting 8 financing strategies in terms of how we can extend social protection coverage in Africa. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is going to be Ms. Fernanda Brollo. Ms. Fernanda Brollo is a senior economist with the International Monetary Fund. The question that we have for you reads as thus. IMF has made considerable progress in its treatment of social spending over recent years and has developed in 2019 a strategy for engagement on social spending. According to ILO estimations, the financing gap for the provision of 4 social protection benefits in terms of maternity, children, disability, and old age, and also healthcare amounts to around 8.5% of GDP. Could you please elaborate on relevant operations for creating more fiscal space for social protection in African member states to fill the financing gap, including in times of crisis such as COVID-19 pandemic. You have 5 minutes, please. Ms. Fernanda Brollo.
Oh, thank you so much for this invitation. I apologize that I turned off my video because I realized the connection was not great today. So it's a pleasure to participate in this event. We all want everybody to have good jobs and good salaries, quality healthcare and education. This is fair and promotes inclusive growth. But we are still far from this, and we need to pave the road to achieve this goal. According to IMF estimates, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals in key sectors by 2030 would require a sizable ramp-up in spending across low-income and developing countries. Estimates for 5 sectors, including health, education, electricity, roads, and water and sanitation, indicates that on average, low-income developing countries would face additional annual spending of 14.9 percentage points of their GDP in 2030. Half of this relates to additional spending needs in health and education. Note that these estimates do not include social protection. Social protection has arguably never been more important, given the unprecedented global recession caused by the pandemic that suggests in the loss of about 150 million jobs and pushing more than 90 million people into extreme poverty. So social protection systems are designed to alleviate poverty, help people to deal with adverse events, find jobs, and protect the aging population. Countries around the world took unprecedented steps to expand social protection systems and spending in response to the pandemic. These policies played a key role in alleviating the impact of the pandemic. However, at the same time, they highlighted important limitations of the existing social protection systems in many countries. Limited infrastructure to identify vulnerable households, distribute benefits, low capacity to raise revenues, high financing needs, all will require unprecedented efforts to sustain international coordination and collaboration. In response to the pandemic, the IMF is taking unprecedented efforts to help member countries save lives and livelihoods, providing emergency financial assistance to over 80 countries, and more is on the way. Nearly all new lending arrangements approved since March 2020 include requirements to protect or expand social spending. But when does the IMF engage in social protection? The fund's engagement with member countries on social protection is guided by the principle of macrocriticality. That is, when something affects or has the potential to affect domestic or external macroeconomic stability. There are 3 interrelated concerns that can make social protection macrocritical: spending adequacy, spending efficiency, and fiscal sustainability. Social spending issues are viewed as macrocritical in most countries. To meet spending needs in a fiscally sustained manner will require emphasis on both enhanced domestic tax capacity and spending efficiency. But low-income countries, in particular, will need external financing, especially in the short run. To raise additional revenues, countries should strengthen tax capacity and revenue administration, including through better governance and digitalization. One of the IMF COVID guidance notes is exactly about this. The name of this note is Tax Policy for Inclusive Growth After the Pandemic. I will pass the link in the chat after, in case you want more details. This paper argues that developing countries should continue to build their administrative capacity to better enforce existing taxes. And tax increases that might not be progressive on their own, such as consumption taxes, might nevertheless be desirable from the perspective of inclusive growth. If the revenues finance spending on, for example, social protection, education, health, and infrastructure, which pursue better standards of living. In this sense, strengthening social protection systems should build resilience against the diverse events of reforms is crucial to protect.
1 more minute, Madam Fernanda.
Okay, thank you. And generate public support for the reforms. Spending inefficiencies are high in many developing countries. Measures to improve efficiency, which heavily depend on strengthening public financial management frameworks, would help governments deliver better outcomes with the same resources. To create fiscal space, countries should improve spending efficiency by eliminating regressive spending, such as subsidies, and reallocate spending to social sectors where is needed. But I have to say that there is no one size fits all. There are huge heterogeneities across countries. Therefore, ultimate advice to countries will need to be further tailored to needs and circumstances depending on the fiscal stance, level of income, structure of the economy, informality, and capacity to tax administration. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fernanda, for that. And in terms of what the IMF is doing, especially in terms of reallocation of resources, but also helping countries to have more social and economic recovery in terms of resilience through external financing. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is going to be Mr. Folusho Okumadewa, lead economist at the World Bank. Mr. Folusho Okumadewa, we know that the World Bank has developed an African social protection strategy for 2012 to 2020. And the World Bank has actually allocated significant funding to countries for the promotion of social protection, especially cash transfer programs. Could you please share lessons learned from World Bank support to countries to implement safety net programs? Can you also elaborate on mechanisms for sustainable and inclusive social protection financing in Africa, particularly to those in the informal and rural economy? Mr. Folusho Okumadewa, you have 5 minutes to elaborate on this particular question.
Thank you very much for this question, and thank you to everyone who had spoken earlier, because I was able to listen to some of the earlier presentations, and that might take a little bit out of some of the things that I might have to say, so I don't have to repeat them. In terms of the World Bank strategy, and based on experience in African region, the World Bank supports social protection is focused on 3 areas: equity, opportunity, and resilience. As you have seen, a sizable number of African countries have one social protection intervention or the other. And on the issue of equity, poverty reduction, vulnerability reduction seems to be the focus of many of what World Bank is supporting in African region. And also there is the great opportunity issues that the World Bank attaches to some of the interventions, particularly for human capital and for jobs creation. And of course, in recent times, there's also support in terms of what social protection and particularly safety net can do on adaptive activity, including climatic changes and other shocks. Now, World Bank social protection support has expanded in the African region in the last 15 years with mixed results, and some of it have already been mentioned in this meeting. There are great experience and great impact when it comes to social assistance, and particularly the non-contributory social protection. And that is why cash transfer seems to be the thing that everybody relates to the moment you talk about social protection, because that has been able to help. Although the coverage is limited, and one will wish that that increases and improves as much as possible. There's limited achievement on labor market issues. And of course, there's great limitations on what social insurance has been able to help with in the African region, unlike when you compare to other regions. World Bank is particularly increasingly focusing on adaptive social protection, helping countries to build resilience, especially in the informal sector, and particularly now in the urban areas, where we find that the issue is becoming more germane, and also helping countries to build systems, because social protection systems, both in terms of the targeting, in terms of the identifications of the poor and vulnerable, in terms of payment system and M&S, seems to be very, very important. And that is an area that the World Bank seems to be focusing on in recent times. Talking about World Bank financing, in the past 10 years, it has been quite significant, but it is quite cyclical. Cyclical in the sense that it's as if it is responding to issues. I mean, the 2009 financial crisis led to a sizable amount of financing from the bank to many of the African regions. And now, again, you can see with the COVID crisis, there's also an increase in financing, both by government themselves and by the World Bank and other partners on social protection. So that has been our experience going forward. Now, but when we look at the government themselves, just like Valerie said, for social protection, generally, you can talk about 5 to 6%, but social assistance is about 1.5% of gross domestic product that many of the African countries are able to spend on this. And this is very, very low. While countries like South Africa, Mauritius, and Lesotho are spending between 3 and 6%, Ethiopia, Malawi, and Rwanda spending slightly above 1%, but countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and Tanzania are clearly below 1%. These are very, very low, and historically low when you compare that to other sectors like energy, healthcare, education, and in many cases to military and security spending. So these are issues that on a daily basis are being discussed with African countries on how to ramp up and increase the financing of many of the African countries spending on social protection. And so what I'll probably spend a little time on is looking at the pathways to bring sustainable fiscal system to support social protection in Africa. And I will say, just like Valerie did, I will focus on 3. The first one will be that there's a need for African countries to spend better. The second is to manage the fiscal policy better, and of course, to expound funding strategies. In terms of spending better, there's the need to look at more effectiveness and efficiency in social protection spending. And one of the areas that we have been discussing with many countries in recent times is the issue of how they can ring-fence social protection budget and expenditure and link it to their monitoring and evaluation system, because that will help them to be able to gain more visibility for social protection within the government budget. I mean, we call this a virtual social fund, because we know it's very difficult for many countries to establish special fund for social protection, because social protection is managed by different sectors, different ministries at different levels of government. But if it were possible for them, and this, thank you, to have a virtual social protection, we think that will be very, very important. The second thing will be what Valerie had said, mobilizing domestic resources by reforming the tax system. And of course, the final one will be to look at flexible financing strategies, particularly looking at contingency or reserve funds, or using some risk transfer mechanisms to be able to respond to shocks. So these are the kind of pathways that are currently being proposed by the bank for working with many countries on how to sustainably finance social protection. And I would like to stop at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Folúṣọ́ Okumadewa. That was really very impressive, especially in terms of the 3 focus areas of the World Bank in the areas of equity, opportunity, and resilience, and also how we need to have efficiency in terms of making sure that we have sustainable financing for social protection in Africa. Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is going to be Mr. Douglas Opio. Mr. Douglas Opio is the Executive Director of the Federation of Ugandan Employers in Uganda. Mr. Douglas Opio, our question for you reads as thus. Options for increasing social protection financing include increasing tax revenues, eliminating illicit financial flows, participation of employers and customers in crowdfunding campaigns aimed at raising funds to support social protection programs. In the point of view of employers, what are the most relevant options for increasing social protection financing where employers can have a leading role to play? and how could they be implemented? You have 5 minutes to answer this particular question, Mr. Douglas Opio. If you would like me to repeat the main question, I'm happy to repeat.
No, thank you. The question is very clear.
Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, moderator. All protocol observed, and thank you for having me for this particular session. Now, I'll start from the point that a job is the best form of social protection. So all the interventions that we take, we should come from that point. The first step we could take to increase financing for social protection is to expand coverage of social security schemes across Africa. As we already know, and of course with our agenda to try and raise that to 40, it's critical that we address the existing barrier, especially to entry into contributory schemes. In most African countries, the schemes are restricted mainly to formal businesses, but also those who have at least 5 employees or more. So that already excludes a significant number of people from enjoying social security or social protection for that matter. And then, of course, the issue of formalization of the informal sector, because the majority of the people work in the informal sector, but quite often they are also working with small and medium enterprise. We need to ensure that we move them towards formality. The informal sector also has informal employers as well. And I think it's important for us to make them more formal so that they can contribute to establish schemes. And then more broadly, creating just a good business environment for small and medium enterprises. Secondly, is the issue of reallocating public expenditure. So shifting to impact. For instance, public works, using an approach that allows, for instance, local contractors to be able to engage with local resources and employ local people. That way, we could increase financing for social protection. Thirdly, is of course adopting inclusive macroeconomic frameworks, and the IMF and World Bank spoke quite extensively on this. So I'll skip it a bit, but the importance of integrating the local players into the global supply chain so that businesses are able to grow. The fourth, which is a major pain, especially in Africa, is addressing the issue of corruption. Corruption constrains the ability of enterprises to create jobs, and therefore the ability to provide additional funding for social protection by employing people and contributing to the existing scheme. My final point is on widening the tax base. There are lots of proposals about introducing new forms of taxes or raising existing ones. But when you look at the tax to GDP ratio in most African countries, it's basically less than 20%. So by increasing the tax base, we actually bring a lot more money in, as opposed to introducing new taxes on already existing businesses, which are already overburdened. That way, the government would have a lot more resources to commit to social protection. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Douglas Opio. Thank you for sticking to time and also for highlighting many of the issues, especially from the point of view of employers, particularly in terms of formalization of the informal sector. So thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is going to be Mr. Kwabena Otto, Research Director, Trades Union Confederation of Ghana. Now, national social dialogue with government, employers, and workers, as well as civil society, is fundamental to generate political will to explore all possible physical space options in a country. in view of adopting the optimal mix of public policies for social protection. The question for you, Mr. Kwabena, is that could you please elaborate on the importance of the participation of workers' organizations in identifying options for creating more fiscal space for sustainable financing of social protection? What has been the role of the workers' organizations in Ghana in such conversations or discussions? You have 5 minutes, Mr. Kwabena. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. Let me begin answering your question with an example. So before COVID hit, the unions in Ghana had pushed government for integrating them a little bit more into economic and social policy making in Ghana. And this resulted in the creation of the Social Partnership Council, comprising government employers and the unions. This council has given the unions better insight and a higher leverage over economic and social policies in Ghana. Now, when COVID hit, the TUC, which is the Trade Union Congress, the largest federation in Ghana, actually pushed government to establish an unemployment insurance scheme, not just for those that have lost their job during COVID, but more importantly, to prepare the country for future pandemics. This was accepted by government, so we are now in the process of establishing an insurance scheme for the unemployed. We also pushed government to establish a training and retraining program for the many that have lost their job during COVID and are therefore whiling at home doing nothing. And the idea is to preserve, upgrade their skills so that it will reduce their spell of unemployment. And it will also ensure that when they return to the labor market, they do so at a higher level of competence and skill. Now, prior to this Social Partnership Council arrangement, the TUC and the unions were very instrumental in the creation of the 3-tier pension scheme, as Mr. Akrofi may have already mentioned. In fact, the Presidential Commission on Pensions was chaired by a trade unionist, a former General Secretary of the Ghana National Association of Teachers. The unions were mindful of two things in reforming the Social Security. First is being able to incorporate the informal economy workers in the Social Security architecture. And this we managed to do through the 3rd tier, which incidentally became voluntary. And we know the challenges of voluntary schemes, as has been mentioned by other speakers. But we also sought to gain control over the management and administration of Social Security. So entirely, the 2nd tier or the 3-tier pension scheme is devoted to workers' contribution that is more or less managed by the workers and the unions themselves. Of course, the outcome of the 3-tier pension scheme has turned out to be different from what we had envisaged. Probably we didn't have the infrastructure and we didn't have the systems to be able to implement it the way we had thought we wanted. So you have a situation where today, those that are retiring on the 3-tier pension scheme are worse off compared to if they had retired under the previous pension arrangement. Of course, again, through our own dialogue mechanisms, we've managed to get government to give them a top-up. Because it is no fault of theirs that you now have a new pension system that promised better and higher pensions, only for them to end up with an inferior pension scheme. So government has also, through the dialogue system, managed to agree to extend a top-up to those that are retiring on the new pension scheme. So these are some of the things we have been doing in the area of social protection. But on the question of financing, I think we should realize that, coverage, social protection coverage in Africa is low, primarily because we are relying on social insurance schemes, which assume that people have capacity to contribute. In most cases, it is not the case. It is also the case because formal employment has become a rarity on the continent. So you have the bulk of people employed in the informal economy. These people are mostly self-employed. It is difficult to enforce contributory scheme or compulsory schemes on them. They have no clearly established employer on whom you can enforce that kind of mechanism. And besides, informal people largely earn very low incomes. and they do not really have the capacity to save and contribute to pension. Now, we probably need to have a mix of contributory and non-contributory schemes, but in the realm of informal economy, we may tilt towards a little bit more towards non-contributory schemes. The question of financing, I think we need to be clear. Some of the issues that have been raised, it's not the first time we are raising them. Extend the tax net, do this, do that. But we are not extending the tax net despite programs and reforms and funding for doing so. The tax net is not being extended the way it ought to be. On the whole, if you take Africa, we collect just about 16.5% of our GDP in taxes. It is about 23% in the Caribbean and about 34% in the OECD. The Nigeria, which is Africa's largest economy, collects just 6.3% of GDP as tax revenues. In 1985, 1996, the average for Nigeria was about 13.1%. Today, it is down to 6.3%. So we need to take the tax thing very seriously. And I think the solution is not simply to say extend it to the informal economy. These are people who are already in a shock, and I'm not sure they have the extra income to be taxed for that matter.
Mr. Kwabena, 1 more minute, please. Could you please round up?
Of course, you have some people in the informal economy that are doing well. We could target them. But largely, on a large scale, majority of informal workers in West Africa in particular are poor, and they cannot be expected to contribute more in taxes. Finally, as a proposal, I think that we need to actually ramp up taxes on the very rich, particularly also in sectors that are growing and contributing to the economy. So for instance, I mean, during COVID, we did everything to protect our natural resources sector. Can we impose a $1 flat tax on every ounce of gold produced in Ghana, $2 flat tax on every barrel of oil drilled in Ghana, in Nigeria, as the example of Zambia and Botswana mentioned by the ILO illustrate? This we need to do because these are the sectors that are the most profitable, that are the most growing sectors, bringing in more resources. But you also realize that these sectors are controlled heavily by foreigners or foreign investors who have very little attachment to the real development of the country going forward. That's the reason why we have mined gold in Ghana for 127 years. But the gold sector is still an enclave in Ghana. So we need to look at the mix of financing and not repeat tired recommendations that have not actually worked in the past. We also finally need to address the question of tax exemptions. Ghana in 2017 promised to reduce tax exemption, but it ended up actually offering tax exemption to the tune of 1.5 billion to unknown entities, sometimes politically linked. That 1.5 billion was 40% more than what the country needed to fund free SHS or free senior high secondary education for 3 years. And this money goes to people, go to firms who are not making any real discernible contribution to national development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kwabena. Thank you for highlighting so many important issues very, very passionately. We appreciate that, especially in terms of how to ramp up tax revenue collection on the continent in different African countries so that we can be able to finance our social protection schemes. Thank you for that. Now we move to the plenary session. Many of the participants have so many questions for our panelists. So what we are going to do, I think I will endeavor to ask one question at least each for each of our panelists. And I want you to really go straight to the answers, answer very quickly because we still have a long way to go today. Now, my first question, which is coming from Shegun Tekun, is going to go for Valerie of ILO. The question goes as follows, Valerie. We have seen a decrease in the funding of social protection floor before the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has further decreased the revenue capacity of the government, thereby increasing the social protection financing gaps. How can we ensure that the private sector help bridge the financing gap? Valerie, you have the floor, maximum 2 minutes to answer this. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you so much, Babatunde, and thank you so much for this question. Indeed, during the COVID-19 crisis, the financing gap for social protection have increased by 30%. So to ensure that the private sector contributes to financing social protection at the domestic level, it is key, as many representatives of employers' organizations have stressed already, that the private sector companies are involved through social dialogue in the design of policies and schemes, are also involved in the management through the social security, social protection boards, the management of the social protection systems, so that they clearly take part in the governance of social security. And of course, that they are compliant with the private sector obligations, which is to finance social security based on solidarity through the payment of the employer's shares of contributions and also of taxes. And yeah, so these are the main ways of ensuring that the private sector is more involved and contributes to the development of social protection systems, including floors. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you for that. The next question is going to go to our IMF colleague, Fernanda. And the question, it's all about coverage and funding levels. Now, although coverage and funding levels appear to be generally low for social protection in Africa, as you have observed. However, there is also the real challenge of optimization and efficiency, as there are all sorts of various efforts going on the ground. How do we address the issues of coordination of existing social protection efforts, as well as monitoring and evaluation? So the key question for you is, how do we address the issues surrounding coordination of existing social protection efforts, as well as monitoring and evaluation? Fernanda, you have the floor. 2 minutes, maximum, please.
Oh, thank you so much for this question. It's an important question. The existing social protection system in place, we should look at that and trying to see the good aspects of that, right? Of course, it's very, we have to go case by case, but I would say that countries should take the advantage of scaling up those programs that are more efficient in reaching those households that are in the informal sector, right? Because especially in Africa, informality is a big issue. So in order to do that, countries would have to scale up capacity. So invest lots of efforts in scaling up capacity in reaching those households, right? And in order to do that, also additional financing is needed, right? The main topic of this session. So, and these also pretty much case by case, a very important thing that I would like to emphasize here, it would be build trust in government. And this is only by through building trust in government, and you can raise additional revenues, increase tax capacity. So it's very important to strengthen revenue administration, improving governance, and digitalization. I think this is a very important issue. So before thinking if we should come with a new program or taking advantage of what we already have, and I would pretty much, as I explained in my how the IMF approach social spending, we look at top-down approach when we are first looking at the lengths of fiscal sustainability and then strengthen these to adequacy and efficiency. So it's very important, the collaboration between the IMF and development partners, because development partners take more a bottom-up sectoral approach where they look at the design of programs and then map these into financing needs. So, and development partners such as the World Bank with a large presence in the country knows much more the details on the existing social protection systems, the weakness and the advantage, and in order to be able to lay down a strategy to strengthen social protection systems. So it's very important collaboration between country authorities, the World Bank, and the IMF. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Madam Fernanda. Our next question is coming from Anatol Mangala, and this question is for our World Bank colleague, Mr. Okumadewa. The question is this: what is the level of harmonization of the World Bank's financing strategy through its social protection department and the health department? Mr. Okumadewa, 2 minutes maximum. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think that question also relates to what my IMF colleague has just mentioned. As I said somewhere along the line in my earlier response, social protection, whether contributory, non-contributory, are operated in many African countries and of course many other countries along so many sectors. And the health sector is a very key and very important one in that sense. So the governance around social protection system is something that the World Bank has been focusing on in many countries in an attempt to help them to even spend better and wiser. The governance structure requires a better coordination among all the sectors. And so that is why when I spoke about virtual fund, we're looking at a situation where all the funding of all the sectors, including the health sector, the education, the agriculture, the women affairs, the social agriculture, the women are focused on the planning and budget and money. And therefore, whatever portion in the Ministry of Health that is focused on the poor and vulnerable will be a key element of this.
We lost Mr. Okumadewa there. I'm sure it's about the internet connection. So I think we'll proceed, and then when he comes back, he can round up what the point he was making. So let me pose another question very quickly to our representative of workers, Mr. Douglas. The question is this: how can we build stronger political will for additional investments in the field of social protection and expand fiscal space? Mr. Douglas, you have the floor. 2 minutes maximum.
Thank you. Just correction from the employer. Thank you so much. So the political will, essentially social protection in itself is a politically correct thing. It's the right thing to do. If you wanted popular support, I think social protection is one of the routes you could take. But I think political will can also be driven from an investment point. In many African countries, there's a lot of investment in infrastructure. But that investment in infrastructure is usually targeting the big companies. It's usually not having a focus, like I said earlier, on socio-economic impact. So by government redirecting most of their bigger investment towards the idea of public infrastructure, which is driven by people, but also driven by local firms, I think we can go a long way to changing that political way. social protection in itself, as I've said, it's already politically correct in itself. It generates popular support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Douglas Opio. Do we have Mr. Kumadewa? Is he back? Has he been able to resolve the internet?
Yes, I am back. If you can confirm that you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Please round up
the
valid point that you are raising earlier on.
Yes, the point I was raising, which I think I almost concluded before I got bumped up by the internet, is that it's obvious that the health sector budget that is focused on the poor and vulnerable, either through the health insurance, should be a key element of a virtual social protection fund in any country in an attempt to ensure integration. That's the summary of what I was trying to explain. But there are many other sectors that are also involved in what we call a virtual social fund. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Folusha Kumadewa. Of course, last but not the least, our very passionate Mr. Kwabena, you spoke so eloquently about tax revenue and tax policy. So the question that we have for you is really regarding the evidence relating to tax policy in maybe in your country or anywhere else. So the question is this: what have we learned from evidence of the current pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of tax policy for achieving social protection and also for inclusive growth in the future, as many countries struggle to recover from the pandemic? Mr. Kwabena, you have the floor. Maximum 2 minutes.
Thank you. I think what we've learned are two straightforward things. COVID has now more or less turned attitude towards social spending and social protection spending in particular positive. Many people are now more willing to accept larger spending for the poor and the vulnerable. The other end of the spectrum is that this is also a time when government finances are seriously impaired, and government is not able to take advantage of the positive public attitude towards social spending because we have not actually created a fiscal space for ourselves even before COVID hit. Most countries in Africa were already in serious debt overhang even before COVID hit, and COVID has made the situation worse. Part of the reason is that, in my view, we have focused on attempting to tax the wrong people, when in fact the sectors that were making money, generating huge export revenues that were being transferred out of Africa in what has now become known as the illicit transfers. If you had taxed those transfers, those resources properly on the continent, maybe the rest they can illicitly transfer. By a natural fact, we have left a tax loophole for multinationals actually producing resources. We have let a huge tax loophole for them. So you have a situation where people mining gold, drilling oil have tax exemptions when they import things through the port. When in fact, things that are being imported through the port to support agriculture are subjected to draconian taxes. So these are some of the things we need to iron out. But of course, it is also a matter of eliminating corruption. Because when you really want people to contribute more, you need to show them that you are using what they are contributing in a better way to further development and to further improve the lives of people. And one approach to be doing that is that when I talk about a flat rate on, let's say, $1 flat rate on each ounce of gold mined in Ghana, can that be earmarked so that we know that it is specifically to fund social protection? It is specifically to help poor and vulnerable people, particularly in the informal economy. You don't miss that one with general revenue that can be used for any other thing. So the governance question is important. It is important both in getting even the informal economy people that have the capacity to contribute, so to willingly contribute. But it is also important in making sure that the people who are actually making money are actually chased to be able to pay their fair share of the tax that we need for development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kwabena. I want to thank all our distinguished panelists for this exciting session. It has been very exciting because you have explored different avenues through which we can raise resources, we can finance social protection schemes on the continent of Africa, especially if you want to move from 17.8% to 40% social protection coverage on the continent. So I want to thank you so much. I think the key takeaways are two for me. One is that we need a mix of finance in order to be able to do this. And that means we have to emphasize more on domestic resource mobilization, which will include raising tax revenue collection in different countries, and then ensuring equity, efficiency, and opportunity in terms of how those resources are allocated, particularly in terms of absorptive capacity. And second key takeaway is really in terms of focusing more on the informal sector, because a lot of our people are still in the informal sector, and we can do this through formalization of the informal sector and use different contributory and non-contributing schemes to support them. So I want to thank all of you for this. Now we are moving to the next session. The next session is going to be moderated by Mr. George Okuto. Mr. George Okuto is the director of the International Labour Organization country offices for Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique. Mr. George Okuto, you have the floor.